What would you do if a guest checked in, but never really arrived? At the Pineview Motel, a seemingly ordinary man requested room number 4. He paid in cash, took the key, and disappeared down the hallway. But the next morning, the room was untouched, and the only clue he left behind was a photograph of himself decades younger. Who was Edward Grayson? And why do whispers claim he died in 1986? This is the story of the guest who never left. Prepare to uncover the chilling truth behind room 4. The guest who never left. The wind howled through the trees that lined Route 66, the skeletal branches scratching against one another like ancient whispers. The Pineview Motel sat there, an aging relic of the 1960s, its neon sign flickering in and out of life. I had been working the night shift for a little over a week and was just beginning to settle into the quiet monotony of the job when he arrived. He wasn't like most guests. No loud greetings, no idle chatter about the road or weather. He entered the lobby as silently as a shadow, his small suitcase barely brushing the ground. "I'd like room number 4, he said. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, yet it carried a weight that unsettled me. I glanced at the ledger. Room 4 was vacant, though rarely requested. Something about it seemed to repel most people. "Are you sure?" I asked hesitantly. "Yes," he replied with a faint smile, handing over a few crumpled bills. As he took the key, his fingers brushed mine, cold and dry, like autumn leaves just before they crumble. The next few days passed without incident. Edward Grayson, as he had signed in, kept to himself. He never came down for coffee or breakfast. Housekeeping reported that the bed remained untouched and that his belongings were neatly arranged, as though he hadn't stayed at all. On the 3rd night, curiosity got the better of me. I knocked on his door, intending to ask if he needed anything. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. "Mr. Grayson," I called out, pressing my ear to the door. There was a sound, a faint shuffling like footsteps on carpet, but it stopped as quickly as it had started. I decided not to push my luck and returned to the lobby, trying to shake the growing unease. By the morning of the 4th day, Edward's absence had become impossible to ignore. I went to check on him again, this time armed with the spare key. When I opened the door, I froze. The room was empty. The bed was still perfectly made, the bathroom pristine. The only sign of his presence was the suitcase, sitting upright on the dresser. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single item, a black and white photograph of a smiling man, Edward Grayson, younger but unmistakable. His eyes seemed unnervingly lifelike, almost as though they were watching me. I closed the suitcase and reported the situation to Mr. Harris, the motel's manager. Mr. Harris took one look at me and laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let me guess," he said. "Room 4? I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. "You're not the first to notice," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Edward's been staying in that room for decades. Problem is, he died in 1986. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "That's impossible. I saw him. I spoke to him." Mr. Harris shrugged. "Car crash, just a few miles down the road. Poor bastard used to stay here all the time. I guess he never really left." I stared at him, waiting for some sign that he was joking. But his weathered face betrayed no hint of amusement. I couldn't get Edward Grayson out of my mind. That night I walked past room 4 and saw the curtains drawn tight. A faint light seeped through the cracks, though I hadn't turned it on. As I moved closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow shifting behind the curtain, tall and humanoid, pacing back and forth. I burst into the room, but it was empty. The suitcase was gone. Weeks passed, and the motel fell back into its usual rhythm. I started convincing myself that the whole thing had been a bizarre misunderstanding. Then, one stormy night, Edward Grayson returned. He entered the lobby just as he had the first time, silent, almost spectral, the same suitcase in hand. "I'd like room number 4, he said, as though we had never met before. "Mr. Grayson," I stammered, "you've already—" He raised a hand to silence me. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and glassy. "Room number 4, he repeated, his voice firmer now. This time, I couldn't resist the urge to investigate further. That night, I crept to the window of room 4, peering inside. Edward sat on the bed, staring at the photograph from his suitcase. Suddenly, his head snapped toward me, his eyes locking onto mine through the glass. The light in the room flickered, and for a split second, his face changed. The skin sagged, his eyes hollowed, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. By the time I looked up again, the window was dark. Unable to let it go, I dug deeper into Edward Grayson's past. I discovered that he wasn't just a traveling salesman. He was the victim of a gruesome accident. His car had skidded off Route 66 and burst into flames. Witnesses reported seeing a figure trapped inside, banging on the windows, screaming for help. No one could reach him in time. His final moments were filled with terror, and they had left a stain, not just on the road, but on the world itself. That night, I dreamt of Edward. He stood at the edge of a dark forest, the flames of his burning car reflected in his lifeless eyes. "You let me burn," he whispered, his voice echoing as though it came from deep within the earth. I woke up, drenched in sweat, the words ringing in my ears. The next day, I decided to put an end to it. I entered room 4 with the photograph in hand. "Edward," I called out, my voice trembling. "I know what happened to you. I'm sorry." The room grew colder, and the light bulb flickered violently. Then he appeared, standing at the foot of the bed, his form flickering like static on an old TV. "Why?" he rasped, his face contorted in anguish. "I didn't mean to disturb you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But you don't belong here anymore. It's time to rest." The suitcase snapped open on its own, and the photograph inside began to burn. As the flames consumed it, Edward let out a guttural scream, his form dissolving into smoke. Since that night, room 4 has remained vacant. Guests refuse to stay there, claiming it feels too cold, too dark. But every so often, I catch a glimpse of a shadow moving behind the curtain or hear faint whispers in the night. Edward Grayson may be gone, but his presence lingers, a silent reminder that some roads and some souls never truly find their way home. Years later, I left the motel, but I couldn't shake the memories of room 4. One day, while driving down Route 66, I passed the spot where Edward's car had crashed. A single roadside memorial stood there, its flowers long since wilted. As I slowed down, a figure appeared in my rearview mirror, a man with a small suitcase, smiling faintly. I didn't stop, but I could swear I heard a voice whisper, "Thank you for remembering." The mysterious footprints. The Pineview campgrounds were known for their rustic charm, rows of wooden cabins surrounded by dense pine trees. It was a place of quiet solitude, a retreat from the noise of the modern world. I had been working there as a groundskeeper for 2 months, mostly managing maintenance and cleaning. Every morning, my routine was the same: inspect the empty cabins, tidy up, and ensure they were ready for the next guest. It was monotonous work, but I didn't mind. At least, not until the day I found the footprints. Cabin 9 was at the farthest end of the grounds, tucked away near the edge of the forest. It had been vacant for a week, its door locked and curtains drawn. That morning, I unlocked it as usual, pushing the door open to let in some light. The moment I stepped inside, I froze. The wooden floor was covered in small, dusty footprints, tiny impressions that looked like they'd been made by a child's bare feet. They crisscrossed the room, leading from the doorway to the bed, and then back to the far corner. I frowned. The cabin had been locked and no one was supposed to have entered since the last guest checked out. A chill prickled the back of my neck, but I shook it off. It was probably just a prank, some kid sneaking in through the window. I cleaned the floor, making sure every print was wiped away, and left the cabin. But as I locked the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, I returned to cabin 9. As I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. The footprints were back. This time, they were even more distinct, as if freshly made. They started at the doorway and trailed across the room, stopping at the bed. The bed itself was slightly askew, its legs no longer aligned with the grooves they had left on the floor. I hesitated, heart pounding. Something wasn't right. I approached the bed, gripping its edge, and hesitated for a moment before pulling it away from the wall. What I found underneath made my breath hitch. A photograph lay there, yellowed and faded with age. It showed a little boy, no older than 6, standing in front of cabin 9. His face was pale and his expression unreadable. I brought the photo to the campground manager, Mr. Carter, an old man with a face as weathered as the cabins he maintained. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice unusually tense. "Under the bed in cabin 9, I said. "It was covered in footprints." He stared at the photograph for a long time, his jaw tightening. "Cabin 9 has a history," he said finally, his tone low. "Years ago, a family stayed there. Their boy wandered off into the woods one night and never came back." My chest tightened. "What happened to him?" Carter shook his head. "They never found him. Some say he got lost, others. Well, there are stories." "What kind of stories?" He met my eyes, his expression grave. "Some say his spirit returned to the cabin, waiting for his parents to come back. You shouldn't spend too much time there." That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the boy in the photograph haunted me, his blank stare etched into my mind. Against my better judgment, I decided to return to cabin 9, determined to figure out what was going on. Armed with a flashlight, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cold, far colder than it had any right to be. The footprints were there again, as clear as ever. As I followed the trail, my flashlight flickered. The prints led to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed unnaturally deep. Then I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind, but it came from inside the cabin. "Where are you?" The flashlight slipped from my trembling hands, clattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. When I finally gathered the courage to retrieve the flashlight, its beam landed on something I hadn't noticed before, a loose floorboard near the corner. My hands shook as I pried it up, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was another photograph, this one even older than the first. It showed the same boy, but this time he was inside the cabin, sitting on the bed with a stuffed bear in his arms. Beside the photograph was the bear itself, its fur matted and eyes missing. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Where are you?" I bolted from the cabin, the photograph and bear clutched tightly in my hands. The next morning, I showed Mr. Carter what I had found. His face turned ashen. "That bear," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The boy had it with him when he disappeared." We decided to search the woods near the cabin. As we pushed through the dense undergrowth, the forest seemed eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Then we found it, a small clearing where the grass refused to grow. At its center was a pile of rocks, arranged in a crude, child-sized cairn. My stomach churned as I realized what we had stumbled upon. We buried the bear and photographs beneath the cairn, saying a quiet prayer for the boy. As we did, the air seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight lifting. That night, when I checked cabin 9, it was finally clean. No footprints, no whispers. But as I locked the door and turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the window. The boy stood there, his pale face framed by the glass. He smiled faintly, then faded into the shadows. I left the campground a week later, unable to shake the feeling that the boy was still there, watching, waiting. To this day, I avoid cabins near the edge of the woods. Some places hold memories too strong to fade, and some spirits never truly find their way home. The woman in the red dress. The Pineview Inn was quiet most nights. Tucked away in a remote countryside, it served as a refuge for weary travelers, a place where the only sounds were the rustling of trees and the distant calls of night birds. I had been working the night shift at the front desk for almost a month, learning the rhythm of the place, the occasional late-night check-in, the hum of the vending machine, and the eerie silence that seemed to envelop the inn after midnight. It was on one of those still, moonlit nights that I first saw her. It was close to 1 a.m. when the glass doors of the lobby slid open. A woman stepped inside, her presence startling against the quiet. She wore a flowing red dress, the kind of elegant garment that seemed out of place at a modest inn like Pineview. Her long dark hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her skin was pale, almost luminescent under the fluorescent lights. "I'd like a room," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. "Something near the pool, if possible." Her eyes, dark and intense, met mine. I felt an inexplicable chill, but brushed it off as fatigue. "We have cabin 3 available," I said, handing her the key. "It's right next to the pool." She smiled, a faint, distant smile, and took the key without another word. As she walked away, the air seemed to grow colder, and I couldn't help but watch her as she headed down the hallway. Her red dress swayed with each step until she turned the corner, disappearing from view. The next morning, as part of my routine, I went to check the cabins. When I reached cabin 3, I found the door slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called, knocking softly before stepping inside. The cabin was pristine. The bed was perfectly made, the bathroom untouched. It was as if no one had stayed there at all. Confused, I checked the guest ledger. The woman's name was there, Margaret Devlin, but there was no other record of her presence. I asked the cleaning staff if they had seen her, but no one had. The unease lingered throughout the day. Determined to understand what had happened, I decided to review the security footage. The footage from the lobby showed her entering the inn, just as I remembered. She approached the desk, spoke to me, and then walked down the hallway toward the cabins. But then something strange happened. As she reached the midpoint of the hallway, her figure began to blur. By the time she should have reached cabin 3, she had vanished entirely. I rewound the footage and played it again. The same thing happened. One moment, she was there, and the next, she was gone, dissolving into the shadows of the dimly lit corridor. My hands trembled as I paused the video. I brought the footage to Mr. Harris, the inn's manager. He was a no-nonsense man, the type who prided himself on keeping things orderly. When he saw the tape, his face darkened. "You shouldn't dwell on this," he said, turning off the monitor. "Who was she?" I asked. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Margaret Devlin. She's been dead for over 20 years. "What?" "She was a guest here once," he explained. "A socialite passing through town on her way to a gala. She drowned in the pool late one night. No one knows how it happened. She was found floating there the next morning, still in that damned red dress." That night, I couldn't shake the thought of Margaret Devlin. Her name, her face, the eerie way she had vanished, it consumed my mind. Unable to resist, I walked out to the pool. The water was still, reflecting the pale light of the moon. As I stood there, staring into the depths, I felt it, a presence behind me. "Why are you here?" The voice was soft, almost mournful. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. She stood at the edge of the pool, her red dress billowing in an unseen breeze. Her eyes were dark pools of sorrow, fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. I don't know," I stammered. She tilted her head as if studying me. Then, without a word, she stepped forward, onto the surface of the water. I watched in stunned silence as she walked across the pool, her bare feet leaving ripples in her wake. When she reached the center, she stopped and looked down into the water. "They never found out," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight of unspeakable sadness. "They never knew what happened to me." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. But she didn't answer. Instead, she slowly sank into the water, her figure fading until only the ripples remained. The next day, I couldn't let it go. I dove into the inn's archives, searching for any record of Margaret Devlin's death. I found an old newspaper clipping. Socialite Margaret Devlin found dead in Pineview Inn pool. Ruled accidental drowning. But as I read further, inconsistencies began to emerge. Witnesses reported hearing an argument the night of her death, but no one had come forward. Rumors swirled that she had been involved in a scandal, that someone wanted her silenced. Her death wasn't an accident. That night, as I walked past the pool, I saw her again. She stood at the edge, her red dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. "I know the truth," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. Her head snapped toward me, and for a moment, her expression was one of rage. Then it softened, and tears welled in her dark eyes. "They'll never pay for what they did," she said, her voice breaking. "But thank you for remembering." With that, she turned and stepped into the water one last time, disappearing beneath the surface. The next morning, the pool was drained for maintenance. At the bottom, workers found an old gold bracelet engraved with the initials MDI, left the Pineview Inn shortly after, unable to face the weight of her sorrow any longer. But even now, on quiet nights, I sometimes dream of her. Margaret Devlin, the woman in the red dress, forever haunting the waters of Pineview. Thank you for watching today's story. I hope these chilling experiences have made you reflect on fears and trust in life. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss out on more engaging stories and interesting content in the future. Thank you for your support, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.